In 1879, in the heart of Scotland, where ancient stone fortresses stood defiant against howling winds that swept across desolate moors, where secrets festered in the cold halls of ancestral estates like rot beneath polished floors, where the line between existing and truly living could be as thin as morning mist over a Highland loch, a young woman moved through her days like a specter haunting her own life. She breathed, she moved, she performed the tasks assigned to her with mechanical precision. But she did not truly live in any sense that mattered, for she had been carefully erased from the narrative of her own life by people who should have protected her, but instead chose to pretend she did not exist. She had a name, Elizabeth Marlowe, though it was spoken so rarely within the walls of Wickthorn Hall that sometimes she wondered if she had imagined it, if perhaps she had always been merely the girl or that creature, or simply nothing at all worth acknowledging. The very sound of her identity might somehow validate her presence in a household that had decided years ago that she was an inconvenience to be tolerated, rather than a human being deserving of basic dignity. She was 20 years old when this story begins, though her face bore the weariness of someone decades older, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from sleepless nights or physical labor, but from years of holding oneself perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly invisible, while the world moved around her as if she were made of air. It was the soul-crushing weight of being invisible while constantly watched, judged, and found wanting by people whose own moral failings were far greater than any sin she could have committed. The estate where she lived in this strange purgatory was called Wickthorn Hall, a sprawling monument to old wealth and older sins. Its gray stone towers reached toward perpetually clouded skies like accusing fingers pointing at heaven, demanding answers that would never come. The Gothic structure rose from the Scottish landscape with its arrow-slit windows that seemed to watch everything while revealing nothing, its gardens meticulously maintained to project an image of prosperity and respectability that concealed the rot festering within. The Sinclair family had owned Wickthorn Hall for 12 generations, each one adding their own layer of pride, prejudice, and carefully maintained appearances to the foundation of inherited privilege. Each generation had perfected the art of hiding whatever failures and cruelties they wished the world would forget, building walls not just of stone, but of silence and willful blindness that allowed terrible things to happen in full view of those who chose not to see. An abandoned stepdaughter lived in the shadows of this grand estate, neither fully acknowledged nor completely cast out, existing in a twilight state that society had perfected over centuries of practiced cruelty. Elizabeth had become a living ghost, present but unseen, breathing but not truly alive, moving through rooms where her presence went unacknowledged except when her labor was required. Her hands bore the evidence of her transformation, calluses and small scars from years of work that no lady should have known, hands that had once been soft and cared for, but were now rough and reddened from scrubbing floors and mending linens by candlelight that strained her eyes into the late hours of night. Her dress, a plain gray thing that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric, hung on a frame grown thin from meals that were afterthoughts, scraps and leftovers eaten alone in her small chamber, while the family dined on courses prepared by a cook who had once known her as the young miss of the house. Her auburn hair, which her mother had once brushed with such tenderness while telling stories of better days to come, was now pulled back in a hasty braid that she managed herself each morning in the dim light of dawn before the household stirred. Her unusual violet eyes, eyes that had once sparkled with childhood joy and innocent hope, now held a wariness that came from years of learning that any moment of visibility might bring punishment, that safety lay only in remaining unnoticed, unheard, as close to invisible as a living person could become. But there was something else in those eyes, something that 10 years of systematic cruelty had not managed to extinguish entirely. A spark of stubborn resistance, a core of steel that refused to be completely crushed, a quiet defiance that whispered in the darkest moments, "I am still here. I still exist. I still matter, even if no one else believes it." She had learned to find small rebellions in memory, clinging to fragments of her mother's voice, her laughter, the feeling of being loved and seen and valued as a human being rather than an inconvenient burden. She stole books from the library late at night when the household slept, educating herself in secret, refusing to let her mind atrophy even as her circumstances tried to break her spirit. She told herself that survival itself was a form of victory, that simply continuing to exist despite everything was an act of defiance against those who wished her erased from the family narrative. But survival without dignity was a hollow existence, a life lived in the margins of other people's stories rather than the center of her own. And as the autumn of 1879 descended upon Scotland with its promise of hunting season and house guests and the careful performances that aristocratic families staged for one another's benefit, Elizabeth could not have known that everything was about to change. She could not have predicted that fate was preparing to send someone into Wickthorn Hall who would refuse to accept the convenient lies, who would see through the carefully maintained appearances to the injustice festering beneath, who would recognize her not as an inconvenience to be hidden, but as a human being deserving of justice and dignity and the life that had been stolen from her. To understand how Elizabeth became a ghost in her own life, how an abandoned stepdaughter came to live in the shadows of a grand Scottish estate, we must return to the beginning, to a time when she was still a child who believed in happy endings, still had a mother who loved her, still thought that family meant safety and home meant belonging. We must return to the moment when everything changed, when death took away her protector and left her at the mercy of people who had no mercy to give. But before we continue with Elizabeth's heartbreaking journey of an abandoned stepdaughter who lived in the shadows, I need to share something with you. Creating these deeply researched historical stories takes countless hours of work, and honestly, it breaks my heart when I see so many viewers watch without subscribing. If Elizabeth's story touches you, if you believe stories of resilience and justice deserve to be told, please take just 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Your support means these forgotten voices get heard. Now, let's return to Elizabeth's world. Elizabeth's earliest memories were of her mother's voice, soft and melodious, reading stories by firelight in the modest cottage where they had lived before Wickthorn Hall entered their lives like a promise that would turn to poison. Catherine Marlowe had been widowed when Elizabeth was barely 3 years old, too young to remember her father, except as a warm presence that had once existed and then was gone, leaving behind only a miniature portrait and a collection of debts that consumed what little he had left behind. Those years between her father's death and her mother's remarriage had been marked by a particular kind of poverty that genteel families experienced, the sort where appearances had to be maintained even as resources dwindled, where pride prevented honest acknowledgement of need, where a widow and her daughter lived in increasingly cramped circumstances while pretending to the world that everything was perfectly fine. Catherine had sold her jewelry piece by piece, had dismissed servants one by one until only a single maid remained, had moved from their family home to a smaller house and then to a cottage on the edge of a village where former friends no longer called. But through it all, Catherine had maintained a fierce determination that her daughter would not suffer for the sins of circumstance. She had taught Elizabeth to read and write, to do sums and understand history, to appreciate music and art even when they could no longer afford lessons. She had told her daughter stories at bedtime about strong women who survived impossible situations through courage and cleverness, about the importance of maintaining dignity even when the world tried to strip it away, about believing that better days would come if one could. Just endure long enough to reach them. "We are not defined by what we have lost," Catherine would say, brushing her daughter's auburn hair with long, gentle strokes. "We are defined by how we carry ourselves through the losing." Elizabeth had been a bright-eyed child who still believed that the world was fundamentally fair, that good people were rewarded and bad people were punished, that mothers and daughters could face anything as long as they faced it together. She had not yet learned that the world was indifferent to fairness, that goodness was no protection against cruelty, that even the strongest love could be severed by death without warning or mercy. When Lord Victor Harrington came into their lives in the spring of 1869, He had seemed like the answer to prayers that Catherine had been too proud to speak aloud. He was a widower himself, his own wife having died in childbirth, along with the infant son who might have secured the Harrington line. He was lonely and seeking companionship, attracted to Catherine's quiet dignity and faded beauty, charmed by the well-mannered child who curtsied properly and spoke when spoken to, and seemed to promise that a ready-made family might be easier than starting over with a new wife and the uncertain prospect of more children. The courtship had been brief, propriety demanding some show of proper waiting, but desperation on both sides making extended delay seem pointless. They married in the summer, a small ceremony in the village church, with Elizabeth standing beside her mother in a new dress that felt like a miracle after years of wearing things mended and let out and made over. Catherine had looked radiant that day, years of worry temporarily lifted from her face, hope blooming in her eyes like flowers after a long winter. For 8 months, Elizabeth had known something resembling happiness at Wickthorn Hall. The estate had seemed enormous to a 10-year-old who had spent recent years in a cottage with 3 rooms and a leaking roof, vast halls that echoed with footsteps, a library filled with more books than she had ever imagined existed in one place, gardens that stretched beyond sight with carefully tended roses and ancient oak trees perfect for climbing when no one was watching. Lord Harrington had been kind in those early months, in the distant way of men who were not accustomed to children, but were willing to tolerate them for the sake of their mother's happiness. He had given Elizabeth a room in the family wing with windows that overlooked the moors, had not objected when she spent hours in his library, had even smiled occasionally at her childish enthusiasm for her new home. But it was Catherine's transformation that Elizabeth remembered most vividly, watching her mother bloom like a plant, finally given sufficient water and sunlight after years of drought. Catherine had sung while arranging flowers in the great hall, had laughed at dinner parties with a lightness Elizabeth had not heard since before her father's death, had seemed to believe that she had finally found safe harbor after years of uncertainty and fear. She had told Elizabeth at night, tucking her into the enormous bed in her new chamber, that they were finally home, finally safe, finally able to stop worrying about tomorrow. "We have been given a second chance," Catherine had whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Lord Harrington has been so generous, so kind. We must always be grateful, always remember how fortunate we are. Whatever happens, Elizabeth, you must always be good, always be grateful, always remember that this is your home now." Elizabeth had promised, had believed with the absolute certainty of childhood that this was indeed their forever home, that nothing would ever separate her from her mother again, that the hard years were behind them and only good days lay ahead. But she could not have known that her mother's death was merely the beginning of her erasure, that the security they had sought would become a prison, that gratitude would become a weapon used to justify cruelty. Winter came early that year, brutal and unforgiving in the way that Scottish winters could be. By December, snow lay thick across the moors, and ice transformed Wickthorn Hall's windows into sheets of crystallized cold that no fire could completely banish. And with the winter came the influenza, sweeping through Scotland like divine retribution, claiming victims without regard for rank or virtue or the desperate prayers of those who loved them. Catherine fell ill in late January of 1870, and within 2 weeks she was dead, gone so quickly that Elizabeth's mind could not process the transformation from mother singing while arranging flowers, to mother gasping for breath in a fevered delirium, to mother lying cold and still on a February morning when ice covered the windows like crystal coffins, as if even nature itself mourned the injustice of a life cut short just as happiness had finally been found. At 10 years old, Elizabeth became an orphan, alone in a house that had never truly wanted her in the first place, protected only by her mother's dying words to Lord Harrington, words Elizabeth would not learn the content of until much later, words that would prove to have been ignored as thoroughly as if they had never been spoken at all. The funeral was small and cold, the ground frozen so hard that the gravediggers had struggled to prepare the plot. Elizabeth had stood at the graveside in her black dress, holding the hand of a maid who was kind but essentially a stranger, watching as they lowered her mother into the earth, and with her, every hope and promise of the 8 happy months at Wickthorn Hall. She did not yet know that worse was coming, that her mother's death had removed the only obstacle preventing her complete erasure from the family she had briefly belonged to. She did not yet know that within 6 months Lord Harrington would remarry, this time to a woman who would see Elizabeth not as a stepdaughter to be raised, but as an inconvenience to be eliminated by any means that preserved the appearance of respectability. She was still a child who believed that adults would do the right thing, that family meant protection, that surely someone would honor her mother's memory by caring for the daughter Catherine had loved so fiercely. She was still a child who did not understand that some prisons had comfortable furniture and ancient stone walls, that some erasures happened gradually enough that no one noticed until they were complete, that some cruelties were practiced with such calculated precision that they appeared almost reasonable to those who chose not to look too closely at the suffering they caused. The transformation was about to begin, and Elizabeth, grieving and alone and desperate to belong somewhere, would have no power to stop it. Lord Victor Harrington remarried with indecent haste, 6 months to the day after burying Catherine, as if he had been counting down the weeks until propriety would permit him to seek comfort elsewhere. The speed of it shocked even the servants who whispered in corners about respect and decency, and whether a man who claimed to have loved his wife could replace her so quickly without revealing that perhaps he had never loved her at all, but had merely appreciated the convenience she represented. The new Lady Harrington arrived at Wickthorn Hall in late summer of 1870, when the moors were purple with heather and the air carried the promise of autumn's coming chill. Her name was Arabella Sinclair, and she was a distant cousin of the family, distant enough that the marriage raised no concerns about propriety, close enough that she had spent years watching younger women marry into better situations, while she aged into desperation that grew more acute with each passing season. Lady Arabella had been beautiful once, and remained so in the way that women of a certain age could be when they understood that beauty was their only currency in a world that valued little else in females. She was 32 years old, which in the unforgiving arithmetic of aristocratic marriage markets meant she was dangerously close to being permanently shelf-stored, relegated to the fate of maiden aunts and poor relations who lived on the charity of more fortunate family members. She had watched her younger sisters marry, had endured pitying looks from former friends who had long since secured husbands and homes and the social standing that came with being a wife rather than merely a daughter. When Lord Harrington's situation became known, a widower with an estate and a title, desperate for a wife who could bring a dowry large enough to save him from the creditors who had been circling like vultures for years, Arabella had seized upon the opportunity with the determination of someone grabbing a lifeline in stormy seas. She brought with her a dowry that her family had scraped together from various sources, enough to satisfy Harrington's most pressing debts and buy him time to repair the financial damage his own poor management had caused. In return for this salvation, Arabella demanded absolute dominion over her new household. She would not be a second wife living in the shadow of a predecessor's memory, would not be compared unfavorably to Catherine Marlowe, would not tolerate any reminder that she was not Harrington's first choice, his great love, but merely a convenient solution to financial problems that threatened his comfortable existence. And Elizabeth represented everything Arabella despised, a living reminder that another woman had occupied this place first, had been loved by this man in ways Arabella never would be, had left behind a legacy that could not be erased simply by dying. The child was also an inconvenience, an expense, a potential claim on resources that Arabella wanted reserved entirely for herself and whatever children she might produce to secure her position. But Arabella was not the sort of woman who acted on impulse or allowed emotions to dictate strategy. Her cruelty was calculated rather than spontaneous, carefully planned rather than reactive, executed with such precision that each step seemed almost reasonable in isolation, only revealing its full horror when viewed as the complete campaign it truly was. The transformation happened gradually, with such calculated precision that by the time anyone might have objected, it was already complete and seemingly irreversible. It began within days of Arabella's arrival, with Elizabeth being told that her grief required isolation, that she should take her meals in her room, away from the family dining table, where her sadness might spoil the atmosphere of the newly married couple's happiness. It seemed considerate, even kind, to allow the grieving child some privacy. The servants who brought her trays to her chamber thought nothing of it, and Lord Harrington was relieved to avoid his stepdaughter's accusing eyes that reminded him too much of Catherine and his own guilty awareness that he had replaced her with unseemly haste. Within a month came the suggestion that the family wing was too luxurious for a child who needed to learn discipline and gratitude, that Elizabeth should be moved to a smaller chamber in the servants' corridor, where she would be closer to the staff who could supervise her properly and ensure she did not become spoiled by excessive comfort. Again, it seemed almost reasonable, framed as concern for the child's character development rather than the first step in her systematic erasure from the family she had briefly belonged to. The governess who had been engaged to continue Elizabeth's education was dismissed as an unnecessary expense. "The child has basic literacy and mathematics," Arabella announced at breakfast one morning, her voice carrying the tone of someone making a practical business decision. Anything more would be wasted on a girl of her station. She would be better served learning household management and useful skills. Lord Harrington, who had never paid much attention to Elizabeth's education, even when Catherine was alive, nodded absently and returned to his newspaper. The governess was gone by week's end, taking with her the last structured connection Elizabeth had to the life her mother had wanted for her. New dresses that had been ordered for Elizabeth's growing frame were quietly canceled. "She has perfectly adequate clothing," Arabella said when the modiste arrived with fabric samples. "We cannot justify such expenses for every child in the household." The implication hung in the air that Elizabeth was not truly part of the family, but merely a charity case being supported out of Christian obligation rather than genuine affection or duty. Most painfully, Catherine's jewelry, the few pieces she had managed to keep through her years of widowhood, explicitly left to her daughter in her will with the hope that Elizabeth might one day wear them and remember that she had been loved, mysteriously disappeared from the small wooden box where they had been stored in Elizabeth's chamber. When Elizabeth, still naive enough to believe that adults would correct such obvious wrongs, mentioned their absence to Lord Harrington, he waved away her concerns with irritation. "You must have misplaced them, child. You know how careless children can be with valuable things. Your mother would not want you handling such items until you are old enough to appreciate their worth." But Elizabeth had seen the pearl necklace around Arabella's throat at dinner that very evening, had recognized the distinctive clasp that her mother had once shown her, explaining that it had belonged to Elizabeth's grandmother and would one day belong to Elizabeth herself. When she opened her mouth to say something, she caught Arabella's eye across the table, a look of such cold warning that the words died in her throat, replaced by the first real understanding that she was alone in this house, unprotected, and that speaking uncomfortable truths would only make her situation worse. Within a year of Arabella's arrival, the transformation was complete. Elizabeth existed in a strange liminal space, not quite family, not quite servant, but something undefined that everyone found easier to ignore than to acknowledge. She had become invisible in all the ways that mattered, her presence tolerated only when her labor was required, her existence otherwise an inconvenience that the household had learned to simply not see. She no longer ate with the family. She no longer occupied a room in the family wing. She no longer received education or new clothing or any of the considerations that would be given to a daughter of the house. She had been erased from the family narrative as thoroughly as if she had never existed at all, and the cruelty of it was that no single step had seemed dramatic enough to warrant objection, each one defensible in isolation, only revealing their collective horror when viewed as the complete dismantling of a child's life that they truly represented. And through it all, Lord Harrington maintained his willful blindness, choosing not to see what was happening under his own roof, convincing himself that Arabella knew best about household matters, that Elizabeth seemed content enough in her quiet way, that surely if something were truly wrong, someone would say something. No one said anything. And so the erasure continued, year after year, until the bright-eyed child who had once believed in happy endings became the 20-year-old woman who moved through Wickthorn Hall like a ghost haunting her own life, waiting for a salvation she had no reason to believe would ever come. The years that followed blurred together in a succession of days that were simultaneously endless and unmemorable, each one a repetition of the last, each one another stone added to the prison that Elizabeth's life had become. By 1879, when she was 20 years old, she had spent a full decade existing in that strange liminal space, not quite family, not quite servant, but something undefined that occupied the shadowlands between recognition and complete invisibility. Her days began before dawn, when the household still slept, and the corridors of Wickthorn Hall were silent, except for the creaking of old stone settling into itself. She would rise from her narrow bed in the small chamber off the servants' corridor, dress in the same faded gray dress she had worn for years, mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric, and begin the tasks that had become her entire existence. She mended household linens late into the night by candlelight that strained her eyes until they ached and her vision blurred, squinting at tiny stitches that needed to be invisible, perfect, beyond criticism. Sheets and tablecloths and Lady Arabella's delicate undergarments all passed through Elizabeth's hands to be repaired, maintained, made presentable for a family that never acknowledged her existence except to leave more work outside her door. She organized the cluttered attics where decades of Sinclair family detritus had accumulated. Forgotten furniture and portraits of ancestors no one remembered, trunks of clothing from generations past, documents and letters and the accumulated refuse of 12 generations of aristocratic life. It was solitary work in dusty spaces where spiders built webs undisturbed, and the only light came from small windows that looked out over the moors with a view of freedom she would never know. She cared for Lady Arabella's aging mother when the woman's dementia made her difficult and unpleasant, when her own daughter could not bear to be in the same room with her. The old woman did not remember Elizabeth's name from one day to the next, sometimes mistaking her for a servant. Long dead, sometimes for her own daughter in youth, sometimes becoming agitated and accusatory, claiming Elizabeth had stolen things or was plotting against her. It required infinite patience and the ability to absorb anger and suspicion without taking it personally, to remain calm in the face of irrational accusations, to provide care to someone who could not appreciate it and would not remember it. She scrubbed floors when the regular maids were too busy with more important tasks, her knees aching against hard stone, her hands raw from harsh soap and cold water. Always in the shadows, always silent, always aware that any complaint might result in her being cast out entirely, sent to some workhouse or charity institution where her fate would be far worse than this invisible servitude. Elizabeth's story of an abandoned stepdaughter who lived in the shadows is one that almost remained forgotten. Stories like these need your voice to reach others who might find hope in them. If you're moved by Elizabeth's quiet resistance, please subscribe and share this video. Every like, every comment, every subscription ensures more hidden histories get told. Let's make sure no one's story remains in the shadows. Now, back to the turning point that would change everything. Lord Harrington had perfected the art of not seeing what made him uncomfortable. He told himself that Elizabeth was being cared for, that Arabella knew best about household matters, that the girl seemed content enough in her quiet way. He did not ask why his stepdaughter never joined them for meals, why she wore the same plain dress year after year, why she had grown thin and pale and silent. Guilt could be managed through willful blindness, and Victor Harrington had much practice in avoiding anything that might disturb his comfortable existence. On the rare occasions when he encountered Elizabeth in the corridors, when she had not managed to make herself invisible quickly enough, he would nod vaguely in her direction and hurry past, as if proximity to her might force him to acknowledge truths he preferred to ignore. Sometimes, late at night when he had drunk too much port, he would remember Catherine and feel a twinge of something that might have been shame, but by morning it would be gone, replaced by the comfortable certainty that he was doing his duty by allowing Elizabeth to remain under his roof at all. But Elizabeth endured because she had no choice, because running away meant certain death on streets that showed no mercy to young women without protection or resources. She found small rebellions in memory, clinging to fragments of her mother's voice, her laughter, the feeling of being loved and seen and valued. She would whisper her mother's words to herself in the darkness of her small chamber. We are not defined by what we have lost. We are defined by how we carry ourselves through the losing. She stole books from the library late at night when the household slept, educating herself in secret, reading by the stub of candles salvaged from rooms where they had burned low and been replaced. She read history and poetry, philosophy and novels, refusing to let her mind atrophy even as her circumstances tried to break her spirit. Each page turned was an act of defiance. Each new idea absorbed was proof that she still existed as something more than a convenient source of unpaid labor. She told herself that survival itself was a form of victory, that simply continuing to exist despite everything was an act of defiance against those who wished her erased. Some days that was enough. The simple fact of still being here, still breathing, still maintaining some core of self that had not been completely crushed by a decade of systematic erasure. Other days it felt like the thinnest of comforts, a rationalization for accepting the unacceptable, for enduring what should never have been endured. But what choice did she have? Where could she go? Who would believe her story or care about the injustices done to a girl with no family, no resources, no power to demand better treatment? And so she continued, day after day, year after year, moving through Wickthorn Hall like a ghost, haunting her own life, visible only when her labor was required, invisible in all the ways that should have mattered. But what Elizabeth could not have known, what no one at Wickthorn Hall could have predicted, was that fate was about to send someone into their carefully maintained world of comfortable lies. Someone who would refuse to accept their version of reality, someone who would see her not as an inconvenience to be hidden, but as a human being deserving of justice. The Duke of Greybourne was coming to Scotland for the autumn hunting season, and his arrival would shatter every careful structure of deception that had allowed Elizabeth's suffering to continue unnoticed and unchallenged for 10 long years. Benjamin Frost, Duke of Greybourne, arrived at Wickthorn Hall on a mist-shrouded October morning when fog rolled across the moors like spirits returning to claim territory they had never truly abandoned, when the very air seemed heavy with anticipation of something significant about to unfold. The ancient estate emerged from the gray landscape like a vision from another time, its stone towers reaching toward clouded skies, its windows reflecting nothing but the overcast heavens. At 32 years old, the Duke was considered one of Britain's most eligible bachelors, not merely because of the staggering wealth he had inherited at 23 when his father died unexpectedly, or the ancient title he bore with its attendant properties and political influence, but because of a reputation for integrity and intelligence that set him apart from aristocrats who confused privilege with virtue. He was tall and striking with dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead, despite his valet's best efforts, and eyes the color of storm clouds over, the highlands that missed very little and forgot even less. His presence commanded attention without demanding it, the kind of natural authority that came not from rank alone, but from genuine capability, and the confidence of someone who had proven himself worthy of the position he occupied. He had built his fortune beyond what he had inherited through shrewd investments and fair dealings, had earned respect in Parliament through principled stands rather than political maneuvering, and had developed a perhaps inconvenient tendency to notice injustice even when looking away would have been more comfortable. He had come to Scotland ostensibly for the hunting season that drew wealthy men to the Highlands each autumn, the shooting of grouse and stalking of deer that provided both sport and an excuse for aristocratic gatherings, far from London's scrutiny. But truthfully, he craved escape from the marriage market, where ambitious mothers pursued him with strategies worthy of military campaigns. Their daughters paraded before him like merchandise at auction, each one more accomplished and less interesting than the last. He needed the wild beauty of Scotland's landscape to clear his mind, to remember that there was more to existence than ballrooms and political maneuvering and the suffocating expectations of a society that valued appearance over substance. And, practically speaking, Lord Victor Harrington owed him a considerable debt from unwise investments that could be partially forgiven through this extended hospitality, a fact that gave Benjamin leverage should he need it, though he hoped such unpleasantness would not prove necessary. The household descended into chaos preparing for the Duke's visit. Lady Arabella terrorized servants into achieving impossible standards of perfection, her voice echoing through corridors as she found fault with arrangements that had seemed adequate moments before. She was desperate to impress a man whose approval might elevate her social standing, whose connections could open doors that had remained closed to the wife of a minor lord with financial troubles, whose presence in her home represented an opportunity she could not afford to waste. She ordered Elizabeth to remain completely out of sight during the Duke's visit, to confine herself to the attics and storage rooms where she would not accidentally be seen by someone whose questions might prove awkward to answer, whose raised eyebrows might expose the shameful truth of how they treated a defenseless girl who should have been under their protection. "You will not show yourself in any of the public rooms," Arabella hissed at Elizabeth the morning before the Duke's arrival. "You will not speak to any of the guests. You will not exist, do you understand? If His Grace should somehow encounter you, you will apologize for the intrusion and remove yourself immediately. Any embarrassment you cause this household will have consequences you will not enjoy." Elizabeth understood perfectly. She had learned over 10 years that survival meant making herself invisible, that safety lay in remaining unnoticed, that drawing attention to herself would only result in punishments both subtle and severe. For 3 days, she successfully avoided all contact with the distinguished visitor, moving through Wickthorn Hall like a ghost completing her assigned tasks before retreating to her small chamber. She heard his voice occasionally, deep and cultured, carrying through corridors when he spoke with Lord Harrington about hunting arrangements or discussed politics over dinner. She caught glimpses of his tall figure from darkened doorways when she had to traverse corridors he might occupy, always ready to vanish into shadows if he turned in her direction. She scrubbed floors in the early morning hours before the household stirred, organized storage rooms while the family entertained their guest in the drawing room, mended linens late into the night when everyone else slept. It was exhausting work made more so by the constant vigilance required to avoid detection, but she managed it because she had no choice, because the alternative was Lady Arabella's fury and whatever new punishments might be devised. But on the 4th morning, fate intervened through the simple agency of a broken lock on the attic door where she'd been sent to retrieve stored linens for the guest rooms. The mechanism had rusted from years of disuse, and no matter how she struggled with it, the door would not budge. Her hands, already raw from cold and rough work, began to bleed as she fought with the stubborn metal, aware that she was running out of time before the household fully awakened and her absence from her other duties would be noticed. She was so focused on the lock, so intent on solving this problem before it became another excuse for criticism, that she did not hear the footsteps approaching down the narrow corridor. Did not realize she was no longer alone until a voice, that deep, cultured voice she had heard from a distance, spoke from directly behind her. "That lock appears to be giving you considerable difficulty. May I be of assistance?" Elizabeth froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she slowly turned to face Benjamin Frost, Duke of Greybourne, who stood in the narrow attic corridor where he had no reason to be, looking at her with an expression of polite concern that would change to something far more significant in the moments to come. He saw a young woman in a dress so faded and patched it was barely identifiable as clothing, her auburn hair escaping from a hasty braid, her unusual violet eyes wide with something that looked disturbingly like fear rather than the practiced deference a servant should show to a guest of his standing. What struck him most powerfully was not her beauty, though she possessed a delicate loveliness that poverty and hardship had not completely obscured, but the way she carried herself with a dignity that seemed impossible given her circumstances, and the small cuts on her hands that told stories of hard use no lady should have known. Benjamin found himself staring with an intensity that was certainly not appropriate, studying this young woman who seemed so out of place in this servants' corridor with her bleeding hands and fearful eyes. There was something in her bearing that contradicted her circumstances, a refinement in the way she held herself despite the poverty of her dress, an intelligence in those unusual violet eyes that suggested education and breeding rather than a lifetime of servitude. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone gentler than he had intended, responding instinctively to the fear he saw in her expression. Emotions flickered across Elizabeth's face in rapid succession: shock at being directly addressed, fear of the consequences this encounter might bring, a flash of something that might have been hope before it was ruthlessly suppressed, and finally a careful calculation about how best to respond. Within moments, her expression settled into careful blankness. the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that showing emotion was dangerous. "I am no one of consequence, Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice cultured and well modulated in a way that immediately struck him as inconsistent with her appearance. "Please forgive the intrusion. I will remove myself immediately." But before she could move, Lady Arabella's voice cut through the corridor like a blade, sharp with barely controlled panic. "Your Grace, what on earth are you doing in this part of the house?" Benjamin turned to see his hostess approaching with rapid steps, her expression shifting through shock to fury to calculated dismissiveness in the space of seconds. It was a remarkable performance, and one that immediately told him there was something significant happening here, something Lady Arabella desperately wanted to conceal. "I took a wrong turn while exploring your magnificent estate," Benjamin said smoothly, watching her face carefully. "I encountered this young woman struggling with a rather stubborn lock. I was merely offering assistance." "How kind of Your Grace," Arabella said through teeth that were almost clenched, "but entirely unnecessary. This is merely a charity case, a distant relative we took in years ago out of Christian obligation, hardly worth a duke's notice." She turned to Elizabeth with a look that promised consequences. "You were told to remain out of sight. Return to your duties immediately." Elizabeth dropped a quick curtsy and fled down the corridor with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to making herself disappear, leaving Benjamin alone with Lady Arabella and a growing sense that he had just witnessed something deeply wrong. Benjamin Frost had built his reputation partly on an ability to read people, to see through convenient lies and identify hidden truths. He had negotiated business deals with men who smiled while planning betrayal, had sat in Parliament with politicians who spoke of public good while pursuing private gain, had learned to recognize the small tells that revealed when someone was hiding something significant. And Lady Arabella was hiding something. The way she spoke about the young woman with casual cruelty, as if discussing an inconvenient object rather than a human being. The slight tremor in her voice that suggested fear beneath the dismissiveness. The speed with which she had appeared, as if she had been watching, waiting to intervene, should exactly this sort of encounter occur. Over the following days, Benjamin made it his business to observe, to ask subtle questions of servants who were shocked that a duke would show interest in household arrangements. He learned to piece together the narrative of how Elizabeth Marlowe, for he had discovered her name through careful inquiry, had been gradually erased from her rightful place in the family. The housekeeper, when approached with the right combination of authority and gentleness, revealed that Miss Elizabeth had once occupied a room in the family wing, had once taken meals with the family, had once been treated as Lord Harrington's stepdaughter rather than as unpaid labor. The cook, her tongue loosened by Benjamin's genuine interest and his assurance that no harm would come from honesty, mentioned that the girl had her mother's education and refinement, that Lady Catherine had been teaching her to be a proper lady before the influenza took her. A young footman, emboldened by port and the Duke's encouragement, let slip that Miss Elizabeth mended the household linens late into the night, that she cared for Lady Arabella's difficult mother when no one else could bear it, that she worked as hard as any servant but received none of the wages or recognition that even the lowest maid could expect. What Benjamin discovered filled him with cold fury, the kind that burned all the more intensely for being carefully controlled, that demanded not merely anger, but action, that refused to accept that such cruelty could continue simply because no one had bothered to notice or care. Elizabeth had not been sent away to school as Lady Arabella had initially claimed when pressed for details. She had been kept as unpaid labor, systematically denied everything that should have been hers by right of being Lord Harrington's stepdaughter. Her education and refinement didn't match her current circumstances, because she had been raised as a lady before being deliberately reduced to something less than a servant. At least, servants were acknowledged and compensated for their work. He contrived to encounter her again, this time in the library where she had been sent to retrieve a book Lady Arabella wanted. Benjamin had positioned himself there deliberately, having learned her schedule through observation, waiting with a patience that surprised even himself. When Elizabeth entered, she froze upon seeing him, that same expression of fear crossing her face before she could suppress it. But this time, Benjamin did not let her flee. He engaged her in conversation about the book she carried, a volume of poetry, and discovered within minutes that she possessed not just literacy but genuine understanding, could discuss themes and meter with the ease of someone who had studied rather than merely read for entertainment. "You have been well educated," he observed, watching as wariness fought with the simple pleasure of being able to discuss ideas with someone who took her thoughts seriously. "My mother believed education was important," Elizabeth said carefully, then added with visible effort, "before she died." "And after?" The careful blankness returned to her face. "Circumstances changed, Your Grace." It was all the confirmation he needed. Combined with what he had learned from the servants, a picture emerged of systematic abuse disguised as household management, of a young woman robbed of her inheritance and her future, of cruelty practiced with such calculated precision that it had gone unchallenged for a decade. Benjamin Frost had never been able to ignore injustice, even when it would have been easier to look away, even when intervention might prove costly or complicated. And this deliberate erasure of a defenseless young woman who should have been protected was an injustice that demanded correction. He would need proof, documentation, legal standing to challenge what was happening here. But he would find it, because letting this continue was simply not acceptable to the man he had worked his entire life to become. The library encounter had been carefully orchestrated, but what transpired there surprised even Benjamin with its intensity. He had expected to confirm his suspicions about Elizabeth's education and breeding. What he discovered instead was a mind that had been starved of intellectual engagement for years, desperately hungry for conversation that treated her as something more than an inconvenience or a source of labor. They spoke of poetry at first. The volume she carried was Wordsworth, and she quoted passages from memory with a precision that suggested repeated reading, treasured moments stolen from a life that offered few pleasures. When he challenged her interpretation of a particular verse, she defended her position with eloquence and logic, then gracefully conceded when he offered an alternative reading she found persuasive. She was everything he had learned to value in people: honest without being harsh, intelligent without being pretentious, kind without being weak. She spoke to him as an equal in matters of ideas, even while maintaining proper deference in matters of rank, a balance that suggested both natural refinement and careful training in social graces that someone had taken time to teach her. 20 minutes of conversation with this forgotten stepdaughter proved more engaging than weeks of London social events with women who had been trained since birth to attract wealthy husbands through practiced accomplishments and careful management of their true personalities. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Marlowe," Benjamin said as their conversation drew to a close, using her name deliberately to acknowledge her identity, her personhood, the thing that Wickthorn Hall seemed determined to erase. The use of her name made her flinch, as if hearing it spoken aloud was somehow painful, a reminder of all she had lost. "You are too kind, Your Grace. I should return this book to Lady Arabella before she wonders at my delay." But as she left, Benjamin noticed the slight straightening of her shoulders, the fractional lifting of her chin, as if being seen, being acknowledged as a person with thoughts worth hearing, had returned some small measure of dignity that years of systematic diminishment had tried to strip away. Over the following days, Benjamin's interest in Elizabeth's situation grew from principled concern to something more personal, more urgent, and with his growing interest came Lady Arabella's increasing alarm, visible in the way she watched him with calculation and barely concealed anxiety, in the way she found excuses to interrupt whenever he seemed likely to encounter Elizabeth, in the sudden strictness with which she confined her stepdaughter to the most remote parts of the estate. Lord Harrington's discomfort also became increasingly apparent. He avoided Benjamin's eyes during conversations, changed subjects when anything relating to family or household management arose, and displayed the nervous energy of a man who knew that secrets were being uncovered and that consequences might soon follow. The shameful way they had treated a girl who should have been under their protection was about to be exposed, and both Harringtons recognized that the exposure would come from someone with the power and position to ensure it mattered. The confrontation that would change everything began building like the storm that gathered over the Scottish moors on an evening in late October. Thunder rolled across the landscape like approaching judgment, each rumble seeming to shake the ancient foundations of Wickthorn Hall. Lightning illuminated the stone walls in brief, violent flashes that made the Gothic structure looked like something from a nightmare, all sharp angles and deep shadows and secrets that could no longer remain hidden. Benjamin had spent the day in correspondence with his solicitor in London, requesting urgent inquiries into the Marlowe family, into Catherine Marlowe's will and financial arrangements, into any legal provisions that might have been made for her daughter. The responses had arrived by express messenger that afternoon, and what they revealed had transformed his suspicion into certainty, his concern into cold determination that justice would be served regardless of the social awkwardness it might create. As evening fell and the storm intensified, Benjamin requested a private meeting with Lord Harrington in the study. His tone made clear this was not a social call or polite discussion about hunting or estate management, but something far more serious that required immediate attention and absolute privacy. Lady Arabella tried to insert herself into the meeting, appearing at the study door with transparent excuses about household matters requiring her husband's attention. But Benjamin's expression, cold and utterly implacable, sent her retreating without the words she had planned to speak. However, she did not retreat far. She positioned herself just outside the study door, close enough to hear every word spoken in voices that would rise with tension as the confrontation unfolded, listening to words that would destroy the comfortable world she had built on cruelty and theft, and the systematic erasure of a girl whose only crime had been existing as an inconvenient reminder of her husband's first marriage. Inside the study, Benjamin stood before the fire, documents spread on Lord Harrington's desk, his posture radiating controlled fury and absolute certainty of his position. Outside, the storm raged with increasing violence, as if nature itself recognized that judgment had finally arrived at Wickthorn Hall, that accounts long overdue were about to be settled, that the comfortable lies that had allowed injustice to flourish for a decade were about to be exposed to the harsh light of truth. Lord Harrington sat behind his desk, his face already showing the resignation of a man who knew he had been caught in wrongdoing, and that the person confronting him had both the evidence and the power to ensure consequences would follow. The reckoning had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. Benjamin began with deceptive calm, his voice level and almost conversational as he asked questions he already knew the answers to. "Tell me, Lord Harrington, what is Miss Elizabeth Marlowe's legal status in this household? What provisions were made for her future when you married her mother?" Lord Harrington shifted in his chair, reaching for the brandy decanter with hands that trembled slightly. "She is my stepdaughter, of course. We have provided her with shelter and care out of respect for her late mother's memory. Surely that is provision enough." "Indeed. And what of her inheritance? Her mother brought nothing to the marriage?" "Catherine was a widow of modest means," Harrington said, the words coming too quickly, too rehearsed. "There was no significant inheritance to speak of." "I see." Benjamin's tone remained calm, but something in his expression made Harrington's face pale. "And her education? Her mother's wishes for how she should be raised? We have done our best given the circumstances. The girl has been cared for." "Has she?" Benjamin interrupted, his voice still quiet but now edged with steel. He reached for the documents on the desk, spreading them out with deliberate precision. "Because these documents, obtained through inquiries to your family solicitor, tell a rather different story." Lord Harrington stared at the papers as if they were venomous serpents. Outside the door, Lady Arabella pressed closer, her breath coming shallow as she strained to hear every word. "These documents reveal truths long buried beneath convenient fictions," Benjamin continued. "Catherine Marlowe was not penniless when she married you. She brought a modest fortune, £3,000, that was meant to be held in trust for her daughter's future, money that would have provided for Elizabeth's education, her dowry, her independence." "There were expenses," Harrington began. "Expenses?" Benjamin's voice hardened. "This money was absorbed into your estate accounts and spent on luxuries for your current wife. New furnishings, jewelry, gowns, while Catherine Marlowe's daughter wore rags and scrubbed floors." He picked up another document. More damningly, Catherine's will contained specific requests. Her daughter was to be raised as a lady, educated appropriately, and treated as a full member of the family until her marriage. These provisions were completely ignored after Catherine's death, when there was no one left to enforce them. "You don't understand the difficulties," Lord Harrington attempted. Enlighten me, Benjamin said coldly. Explain to me how financial difficulties justified treating a child under your protection as unpaid labor, how they justified denying her education, stealing her inheritance, erasing her from her own family. Each justification you offer is more pathetic than the last. The confrontation grew heated as Harrington attempted various defenses, that Arabella had assured him Elizabeth was content, that he had assumed she was being properly cared for, that household management was his wife's domain and he had not wished to interfere. Each excuse rang hollow, each one revealing the depth of his willful blindness, his cowardice in allowing cruelty to continue rather than confronting the woman he had married. Benjamin listened with mounting contempt before delivering his first ultimatum. You have two choices, Lord Harrington. Either Elizabeth Marlowe will be immediately restored to her rightful position as your stepdaughter, with full acknowledgement of her status and complete restitution for 10 years of exploitation, or I will ensure that every aristocratic house in Britain knows exactly how you and your wife have abused a defenseless orphan who was placed under your protection by her dying mother. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I will see to it that your name becomes synonymous with cruelty and dishonor. Your daughters, if you have any, will be unmarriageable. Your social standing will be annihilated. The destruction will be complete and irreversible. Do you understand me? At that moment, Lady Arabella could contain herself no longer. She burst into the study, her carefully maintained facade shattering like crystal dropped on stone. How dare you? How dare you come into our home and threaten us over that creature? Arabella, Lord Harrington began, but she rounded on him with fury. Be silent, you spineless fool! I told you this would happen if anyone noticed her. She turned back to Benjamin, her face twisted with rage that revealed the depths of her cruelty. She is nothing, an inconvenience we have tolerated out of misplaced charity. We have fed her, housed her, given her purpose when she would otherwise be utterly useless. You speak of her as if she were an object rather than a person, Benjamin observed with icy disgust, because that is all she is. A reminder of your predecessor, a drain on resources, an expense we cannot afford. The words poured out in a torrent of admission. I have deliberately kept her in the shadows to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Someone noticing, someone questioning, someone interfering in matters that are none of their concern. Benjamin listened to this outburst with mounting disgust, allowing her to condemn herself with her own words. When she finally fell silent, breathing heavily, he delivered his second ultimatum with absolute finality. I am removing Miss Marlowe from this household immediately. She will be under my protection until proper arrangements can be made for her independence and the restoration of what was stolen from her. She will leave with me tonight. You cannot, Arabella began. I can, and I will, Benjamin interrupted. And if you attempt to prevent her departure, if you spread any lies about her character to protect your own reputation, I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure your complete ruin. My wealth, my position, my connections, all of it will be directed toward making certain that you suffer consequences for what you have done to that girl. He straightened, his expression cold as Scottish winter. Have her summoned here. Now. Or I will go find her myself and carry her from this house if necessary. The choice is yours. But her departure is not negotiable. Outside, thunder crashed as if heaven itself approved of this judgment. Inside the study, Lord Harrington looked at his wife's furious face, then at the Duke's implacable expression, and recognized with the clarity of the defeated that he had gambled poorly and lost everything. Send for her, he said quietly, the words of a man who had finally run out of ways to avoid the consequences of his own moral cowardice. A servant was dispatched to find Elizabeth, and the minutes that followed stretched with unbearable tension. Lady Arabella stood rigid with fury, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Lord Harrington had retreated behind his desk, like a man seeking shelter from a storm he could no longer control. Benjamin remained standing, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, watching the door through which Elizabeth would enter, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether fear would trap her in this prison for the rest of her life. When Elizabeth finally appeared in the doorway, she was frightened and confused, her violet eyes darting between the three occupants of the study with the wariness of someone who had learned that being summoned by authority figures inevitably meant punishment. She had clearly dressed hastily, her hair still escaping its braid, her hands bearing fresh cuts from whatever task she had been performing when the summons came. She looked like someone expecting to be struck, her shoulders hunched in anticipation of verbal blows that had become as routine as breathing. "You sent for me, my lord?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, directed at Lord Harrington, but not daring to meet his eyes. Benjamin stepped forward, and Elizabeth flinched slightly before he could speak, a reaction that made his jaw tighten with renewed anger at what had been done to her. "Miss Marlowe," he said gently, using her name with deliberate respect, "please, sit down. What I have to tell you may come as something of a shock." It was the first time in 10 years that anyone had addressed her with such courtesy, offered her a chair in a family room, spoken to her as if she were a person deserving of consideration. Elizabeth remained standing, confusion evident on her face, certain this was some kind of trap but unable to identify its nature. "I have been making inquiries into your situation," Benjamin continued, his voice steady and kind. "Terrible injustices have been done to you, Miss Marlowe. Injustices that your mother tried to prevent, that were carried out in violation of her explicit wishes, that have continued for 10 years because no one with the power to stop them was paying attention." He proceeded to explain everything he had discovered: her mother's modest fortune that was meant to secure her future, the £3,000 that should have been held in trust for her education and eventual independence. He told her about Catherine's will, about the specific provisions requesting that her daughter be raised as a lady, educated appropriately, treated as a full member of the family until her marriage. "These provisions were completely ignored after your mother's death," Benjamin said, watching as comprehension and grief warred on Elizabeth's face. "The money that should have been yours was absorbed into the estate accounts and spent on luxuries. Your inheritance was stolen. Your mother's final wishes were violated, and you have been treated as unpaid labor for a decade when you should have been cherished as the daughter of this house." Elizabeth stood frozen, her mind visibly struggling to process this sudden reversal of everything she had believed about her circumstances. She had thought herself powerless, worthless, deserving of her treatment, because surely if it were unjust, someone would have stopped it. To learn that her mother had tried to protect her, that provisions had been made and then deliberately ignored, that her suffering had been unnecessary and illegal. It was almost too much to absorb. "I am offering you a choice," Benjamin said, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that demanded she truly hear him. "Come with me now to my estate, where you will be treated with the dignity you deserve, where proper arrangements can be made for your independence and the restoration of what was stolen from you. Or, if you somehow prefer familiar misery to uncertain freedom, you may remain here at Wickthorn Hall." The choice seemed impossible. A dream offered to someone who had learned not to trust dreams, freedom extended to someone who had forgotten what freedom felt like. Elizabeth's gaze moved slowly around the study, taking in each person present as if seeing them clearly for the first time. She looked at Lady Arabella's furious face, twisted with rage that her comfortable world built on cruelty and theft was collapsing, that the girl she had worked so hard to erase was suddenly visible, suddenly defended by someone with the power to demand accountability. She looked at Lord Harrington's ashamed avoidance of eye contact, the cowardice of a man who had allowed terrible things to happen through willful blindness, who had betrayed his dead wife's trust and her dying wishes, because confronting his living wife's cruelty would have been uncomfortable. Through the open door, she could see servants gathered in the hallway, their expressions showing shocked approval that someone had finally noticed, finally cared, finally intervened on behalf of the girl they had watched suffer for 10 years while being powerless to help. She thought of her mother, who had loved her, who had sung while arranging flowers and brushed her hair with gentle hands, who had tried to protect her even from beyond death through careful provisions in her will. Catherine Marlowe would want her daughter to choose life over merely existing, to seize this chance at freedom even if it meant embracing uncertainty, to honor the love that had tried to build walls of protection around her future. And finally, she looked at Benjamin Frost, this duke who had seen her when everyone else had chosen blindness, who had cared about justice when indifference would have been easier and more convenient, whose storm-gray eyes held only compassion and fierce determination that she be given the choice her mother had tried to ensure she would have. Elizabeth took a breath that felt like the first real breath she had taken in years, deep and full and free of the constant weight of fear and resignation that had compressed her chest for a decade. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than she had heard it in her own ears since childhood. "I will go with you, Your Grace." The words changed her destiny. 4 words that chose freedom over familiar chains, that honored her mother's love by accepting the protection that love had tried to provide, that demonstrated that 10 years of systematic cruelty had not managed to completely crush the core of strength that survived within her. The storm outside seemed to rage with renewed fury as preparations were made for immediate departure. Lady Arabella's protests were ignored with the thoroughness they deserved. Lord Harrington signed documents that Benjamin's secretary had prepared, acknowledging debts owed and agreeing to restitution, his hand shaking as he put his name to paper that would ensure Elizabeth received what should always have been hers. Elizabeth was given 20 minutes to pack her few possessions, a task that took less than 10, for she owned almost nothing. The plain dresses that were more patched than original fabric, her mother's miniature portrait that she had managed to hide, a handful of books she had stolen from the library over the years. Everything that mattered to her fit into a single small trunk that a footman carried to Benjamin's waiting carriage. Benjamin's coachman protested the dangerous weather, but his master's expression made clear that delay was not acceptable. The carriage was prepared, horses stamping nervously as lightning illuminated the courtyard in brief, violent flashes. Rain hammered against cobblestones with the force of divine judgment finally being executed. Within 1 hour of being summoned to the study, Elizabeth Marlowe left Wickthorn Hall for what everyone present knew would be the final time. She climbed into the carriage with Benjamin's assistance, his hand steady and warm on her arm as she stepped up into the interior where plush seats and warm blankets awaited, luxury she had not experienced since before her mother's death. As the carriage rolled away through rain-swept darkness, Elizabeth looked back once through the window at the stone prison where she had been buried alive for 10 years. The Gothic structure loomed against storm clouds, illuminated by lightning that made it look like something from a nightmare, which, in truth, it had been. She watched it recede into the distance with a mixture of relief and disbelief that she was truly leaving, truly free, truly being offered a future beyond mere survival. Then she turned to face forward toward an unknown future that held more hope than any past she could remember. Across from her in the carriage, Benjamin sat quietly, allowing her this moment of transition without demanding conversation or gratitude or anything beyond, her simply being present, being safe, being on her way to somewhere better. Elizabeth's journey from an abandoned stepdaughter who lived in the shadows to a woman who chose her own freedom reminds us that every story of injustice overcome matters. But here's the truth. I can only keep telling these powerful historical stories if you, dear viewer, help spread them. Right now, less than 10% of you who watch are subscribed. If Elizabeth's courage moved you, if her story made you feel something, please, don't let this be just another video you scroll past. Subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment telling me which part of her story resonated most. Your engagement determines whether stories like Elizabeth's reach the people who need to hear them. Together, we can ensure no one remains forgotten in the shadows of history. What Elizabeth and Benjamin could not have known that storm-lashed night was that her departure was not an ending, but a beginning. The first chapter of a life that would be defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to become. The restoration of her inheritance would take months of legal proceedings, but it would come. The healing of wounds inflicted over a decade would take years, but it would happen. And the partnership that would grow between the Duke, who had refused to look away from injustice, and the young woman who had survived it with her capacity for hope intact, that would become something neither had expected, but both would cherish. The carriage disappeared into rain-swept darkness, carrying Elizabeth Marlowe away from shadows toward light, away from erasure toward visibility, away from mere survival toward something that might finally, blessedly, be called living. Behind them, Wickthorn Hall stood silent in the storm, its secrets exposed, its cruelties finally answered, its comfortable lies shattered beyond repair. And ahead, though neither could see it yet through the darkness and rain, the dawn was waiting.